Obvious, isn't it? Thank you. Sorry about that. Okay, good afternoon. My name is Sheila Watson. I'm Deputy Director of the FIA Foundation, a UK-based philanthropy which works supporting safe and sustainable mobility globally. Visit our stand opposite Hall 3 and find out more what we're doing. I'm also co-chair of the Sustainable Mobility for All Gender Working Group with Jim Walker of Walk 21, who sadly can't be here today. I'm delighted to chair this press event at which a new piece of work from the Some for All Gender Working Group is being launched. The work, which considers the place of women in the transport sector, springs from the initial work of Some for All, the so-called GRA, which identified a real gap in understanding the needs of women as users of mobility services, as well as a dearth of us as workers and decision makers in the sector, the two of those things no doubt being related. Even here at the ITF, I understand that only 7 of the 64 member countries have a female transport minister. And whilst well over 80% of our panel is female, don't let that sort of deceive you. In the sector, only 17% of transport workers are women. And that is not only unfair because it often springs from a lack of opportunity, but it also stops the sector from addressing its many skill shortages. And really importantly for us at the foundation, it's a limiting factor in delivering the climate action that we need. And that's why we're so happy to have supported the work. So I will now hand over to Isobel Duxfield of POLIS to introduce herself and POLIS, and Heather Allen, an independent consultant, who are the authors of this report, to present it to you. And then when they finish their presentation, we can take any questions you might have on the content of the report before turning to Alana Dave, who is Director of Urban Transport at the International Transport Workers Federation, also ITF, but a different one. Bingyam Reha from the World Bank, Global Practice Manager for Transport, and Magda Olzak, Manager of Summit International Relations at ITF. They will give some reflections on the report, a little bit about what they're doing in this field, but they'll be very quick. So there'll be a chance for questions after them also. So over to you, Isobel.
Hello. Thank you, Sheila. So my name is Isobel Duxfield, and next to me is Heather Allen, and we are the co-authors of the report. So we're here to present the research and toolkit, and it's called Gender Imbalance in the Transport Sector, a Toolkit for Change. And so it's information and guidance aimed at practitioners across the sector to understand the key barriers for women entering the sector and how these can be tackled effectively. So why is this needed? I think this was outlined briefly by Sheila, but I think this infographic gives you kind of all the information you need. So women account for 16.8% of the transport sector globally. Now, often we say they account for 20%. I've heard that banded around over the last few days, but actually it's lower. It's 16.8%. And this does differ regionally and it differs by mode, but this is present from the engine room to the boardroom. As Sheila just said, we're here at ITF and only 7 of the 64 member countries have women transport ministers. Across the European Union, that is a similar number. And so what this toolkit does is it builds on some of the policies that have been made over the last decade to look at how these policies can be translated into action on the ground. And we know that organisations across the transport sector are looking to change. They are looking to take action, but often they don't know exactly how to get from A to B, how to address this imbalance. And so what the toolkit does is it does build on some of the fantastic work that's gone before. There have been several pieces of work that have aimed to address this, but as we've seen, the statistics haven't changed over the last decade. So what we do is we build a really comprehensive global and cross-modal analysis of the gender imbalance to date and look at the lived experiences of women in the sector. So it's not just about data, it's about what does it mean to be a woman in the transport sector and what are those key barriers and how does that shape women's ability to enter, remain in the sector and their career development. So the goal, what we try to do, as I say, we take policy as our point of departure to look at how we can put action on the ground. So we put ourselves, we have a research and we have a toolkit. And what we do is we put ourselves in the practitioner's shoes. What do you need to implement more gender equal employment? What are the practical, so it's practical, it's condensed, and it's engaging. And so we identify the key barriers. We have a range of really in-depth case studies to look at how organizations can use those to stimulate change in their own organization. And most importantly, it's designed to be used. It's not designed to be just a report that you go and put on the shelf afterwards. It's designed for people to look at and think, okay, so this organization is doing this. How can I replicate this? And yes, we know that transport, from aviation to marine to public transport to shared mobility, they have very specific employment conditions, but they do share a lot of similar things that they can be doing to create a more gender balanced sector. And so what we did is it's an extensive literature review. And then we had a survey, which was completed around 300 responses. And then we had in-depth conversations with leading women and men across the sector to really pull together what is happening in all corners of the globe across all modes.
Thank you, Isobel. Yes, so I'll just take it a little bit further from here to give you a little bit of an insight of some of our key findings as well. I've been working in this space for 15, 17 years now, specifically on gender and sustainable transport. So I have seen some change, I have to say. But with that, I have also very conscious of the fact that the statistics haven't really changed. I've been using the same ones for, 15 years. So we need to actually look at what is the state of the art now in employment and how can that become more women friendly, more diverse, more equitable, because transport is also facing key challenges. And we'll go on to that a little bit later. On this slide, you'll see that one of our questions was, would you agree or disagree that women can easily join and work in transport if they have the right qualifications? And, it's a pretty overwhelming agreement that, yes, there are no actual official barriers to women joining transport. Another one of the questions that we had was not on this slide, but actually I found really interesting was we asked people, men and women who responded to our survey, whether they had chosen transport as a career. 47% chose transport as a career. So as the predominance of our respondents were female, we can deduce that women are now choosing transport as a career. And in that box in the survey that we put any other comments or whatever, a number of comments came through. I'm a keen cyclist. I want to make a difference. I'm a transport planner, and I think that there is a gap in this. There are many, many responses of very great passions from women to try and make a difference. So we are entering the sector and we are able to be given the opportunity, as it were, to make some changes. So from our work, we found that there were 5, let's say, key barriers. And with each of these key barriers, there will be an entry point that we also identified. Some of them are very specific to transport, and some are more generalized across the whole of the working environment which women face anyway. So obviously within transport, there is still deep gendered stereotyping for the different types of jobs that are available. And this is in particular around the technology field and technical positions. A little anecdotal evidence that I found really telling was that in Ireland, they did a research on the gender pay gap within the Department of Transport, within the Ministry of Transport. And there is still a pay difference between men and women, and it is always because the men have the higher technical positions, so they are paid more. So it's one of these invisible kind of barriers that we found. There are discriminatory work practices and cultures, and this is particularly at the lower levels of the working experience. And it's also quite modal defined. So maritime has great difficulties, in fact, in making sure that there are equitable and respectful workplaces, but they're doing a lot of work on that. Aviation, in fact, they have this kind of, sandwich effect with pilots being highly revered, but very few women pilots, apart from India, where there are an enormous amount of women pilots. We don't know quite why. And down at the lower ends, particularly in popular transport, informal transport, there are some very basic needs that mean that women don't enjoy working in the transport sector. And it comes down to quite critical and clear issues around hygiene. Bathrooms, for example, there aren't enough bathrooms in many metro stations for the staff, not necessarily for the passengers, but for the staff. Even in the UK, in one of our interviews, it was very interesting to hear an operator saying, we've expanded our network, but we've suddenly found that our women drivers won't take on those routes because with the expanded network, they have got nowhere to go in the bathroom at the other end of the circuit. Men find an opportunity, shall we say, whereas they asked their bus drivers and they found a very local option of an agreement with a hotel that the bus drivers could use the sanitary and rest areas of the hotel. So it can be overcome, but we're not thinking of that. Obviously, something that is not just unique to transport is the lack of provision of childcare, paternity, maternity leave, whether it's mandatory, whether it isn't mandatory, the fiscal arrangements of having two salaries coming in. This hits women more than men. We also found that there is still this glass ceiling. It's an invisible glass ceiling because in policy, it doesn't actually exist any longer. And we found that people felt that there had been a lot of change in policy and that the policy environment was relatively okay, but the invisible glass ceiling still remains, and it is there, and it is a barrier for career development. There's a flip side to this, that men actually in middle management are also finding that now they're reaching a glass ceiling, because if there is a woman in the pool of professional development, very often she will be chosen, even if the qualifications, they're pretty much equivalent, but they might not be quite as good as his. But she'll get chosen, not him. So there is now a little bit of kickback on that, which we need to be quite careful about. And of course, it's not unusual that there's a lack of all forms of diversity at every level within the transport employment field. So the toolkit actually gives these solutions based on our interviews and based on our literature review to overcome and show what is going on. We have more than 25 case studies from all over the world covering all the different modes of transport. You can see them listed here. A lot to do with STEM, a lot to do with encouragement, mentoring, awards, childcare, really an absolute wealth of information. And I can only say in the 15 years when I started in this area, I would not have had this kind of resource. I would have found one or two, but now we have some fantastic examples of particularly the private sector, but also the public sector, really making some change and really trying to increase the diversity of the workforce. So download the report here. There's a few examples here. Thank you for your foundation for making sure that they actually made it here. It's a big report. It's got a lot of information. And I'd just like to add one thing. We need to make this issue of gender diversity and inclusion relevant to the needs of the transport sector. And if I can give you one little information, which is, I think, key. there's going to be a huge number of gaps in positions, unfilled positions across the different sectors of transport. And one example is that now, according to the International Road Union, which did a big 25-country study, the 2.6 million heavy-duty vehicle drivers that are still needed in the sector. So these are positions that have been advertised and have not been filled. Just in Europe, there are 380,000 that are missing. So women and all the kind of diverse ethnic options of different profiles of people can actually help fill a lot of these employment gaps. And I hope Alana will probably elaborate a little bit on that. So thank you very much for your attention, and thank also our sponsors and the opportunity to work on this particularly important aspect, I think, because very often the state-of-the-art employment and the gender needs in that employment has been a little bit overlooked. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Heather and Isobel. So right now, if people have questions either in the room or I believe online, they'll emerge on this laptop. That's why I keep looking this way. I'm not kind of nervous that someone's after me and they're going to come in the door. Then please feel free to ask those questions now if it's very specifically about what Isobel and Heather have just presented. Which just shows the clarity of a woman presenting a report. No questions. Excellent. That's great. So we can move on. But I mean, there will be, I hope, another opportunity because our next contributions will be very brief. I'm going to hand over to you, Alana.
Thanks, Sheila. So I'm from the International Transport Workers Federation, and our membership organizations represent about 20 million workers in the transport workforce. Of this 20 million, only about 15% are women, which I suppose also reflects the composition of the wider transport workforce. From our perspective, I really just want to reinforce the importance of this toolkit, particularly given the role that trade unions can and do play in negotiating improved terms and conditions for women in the workforce, which directly and indirectly challenge, discrimination, stereotypes, and inflexible working practices, all of which emerged as the big barriers in the toolkit. We know that this is important, but also not sufficient. The overall message of the toolkit is that there's an urgent need for transformative change, and all stakeholders, including the workforce, must see themselves as the agents of this change. The 5 areas of action in the toolkit point to the really urgent need to end the systemic exclusion of women from the transport sector. And our role as an organization is to build the capacity and voice of the transport workforce to take collective action in support of women's inclusion and rights. So for us, this toolkit is a resource that we're going to be using to stimulate ideas, to stimulate thinking and learning on the different forms of intervention that have brought about these results. I just want to share a few examples from our work, which are complementary to some of the issues in the toolkit. We're focusing on the future of work, where almost little or no attention has been paid to the particular impacts of technological change on women in the transport workforce. So we've developed case studies, we've developed collective bargaining language, which could be used by all stakeholders to build a gender-responsive approach to the introduction of new technology. We've called for gender impact assessments, as well as women's involvement in decision-making on new technology. Another example of our work regarding workplace culture, and Heather referred to this, is the particular issue of sanitation. A key finding of our research on women in public transport showed that a lack of gender segregated and safe sanitation facilities really affected the retention of women in the public transport workforce. It is a huge health and safety issue and risk for women. We've gathered stories from women in public transport, and these stories show a shocking insight into the chronic neglect of women's needs. So we've developed a global sanitation charter for advocacy purposes, and we have a sanitation toolkit full of good practices and examples of what is being done to change the workplace culture on sanitation. The last example that I want to use from our work is the global agreement we have with the UITP, which is the international umbrella body of employers in public transport. It's a very comprehensive agreement covering the recruitment, the retention, and the need for systemic change in the public transport workforce. And what I really want to emphasize, this is not just a policy on women's employment and gender equality. It's a framework for action, which has the potential to bring about important change at a workplace level. At a global level, we have a joint campaign with C40 cities for investment in public transport. Any significant investment will create tens of thousands of new jobs. And this has the potential to significantly shift the gender composition of the workforce. But we can't assume that will happen. It will only happen if we lobby for it. So really, in conclusion, I want to say that from our point of view, this toolkit can't just be for information purposes. It can't just be something nice to read, but essentially remains kind of words on a piece of paper. It must be a tool for mobilization and action. And as the workforce, we are ready to play our part in taking that action.
Thanks so much, Alana. It's really quite heartening to hear that in this case, as in all fights for rights, this piece of work is going to be a contribution to collective action. So thank you for that, Alana. Thank you very much. And now over to you, Binyam, from the World Bank, of course, the home of Some for All. So a few words from you, Binyam.
Great. Thank you, Sheila. It's really great to be here, and thanks for the excellent toolkit and the presentation you've made. Excuse me. Yeah, so first I think is to say congratulations for really producing a path-breaking toolkit that is going to be very, very useful for many countries, for many practitioners. Secondly, I think this issue about gender in the workplace, in the transport sector, obviously, as it was noted in the toolkit, has many causes, from legal, from cultural, many causes for it. I just wanted to maybe reinforce and highlight a couple of the things that were said in the toolkit and in the discussion. I think first is what needs to come out maybe in our conversation is the narrative about the transport sector itself is changing. We're no longer the traditional sector that people go into the boonies to build highways and railways, but actually transport is now the way we are actually approaching it in the World Bank is it's about access, it's about climate, it's about linking opportunities. So I think especially for women professionals, those things are really much more important because they can see how they can contribute into those areas. So if we actually position the transport sector differently, then we can actually then make transport much more appealing to women in the workforce itself. So we need to work on that. I think secondly, we have looked at on a number of things, why it's important to actually make sure that the labor market works for women. Because it's not only the women who actually get disadvantaged. The famous American economist, Gary Baker, labor economist, said, discrimination actually hurts the business as well, because you're not hiring the best person in that field. So by having this artificial barriers, businesses and policymakers and governments are actually losing out for the best talent. I mean, we see it now in a lot of things. Women are the ones actually who are getting more qualified in a lot of the positions, and it has nothing to do with them being women or whatever, but the kind of sophisticated transportation issues that we have to tackle was in today's world, and they have that better education and experience. So yeah, so I think countries will do very well if they remove these barriers. That's why we've been working with several countries. Maybe I can give a couple of examples. In Azerbaijan, for example, there are, on the books, legal barriers for women to work. So our team has been working with them to remove 700 laws or provisions in a regulatory framework that would prevent women from participating in the labor market. So that, I think, is a minimum, at least, that we can do. Secondly, we have been through our projects supporting internship programs in Armenia and a few other Eastern Europe countries, and also in Africa, where actually women get support to intern in government institutions and policymakers. I think the internship is reaching women professionals or even other underrepresented, for example, Africans in the workplace is also an issue. So having this internship is hugely important. I've seen it myself in the World Bank. When you give an internship for a young woman, when I was in Beijing for many years, we used to get very sharp, smart, recent graduates. So they went on to become professionals because they don't have that network to go and kind of find a job that most people get. So internship, is very important. And as a policy, actually, I wish many organizations make it a priority to just give that opportunity. So that's what we're doing. So yeah, so I think all the recommendations here are very practical. And I like the fact that it's also based on surveys and interviews with data, and then going into an actual practical guidance. So I'm sure this is going to be very useful for our team in the bank and for many of our client countries. And finally, I have to say, I think this is like a great example of Some for All in action, really. This is exactly what Some for All is supposed to be doing. And now you're doing a great job. I mean, yesterday we had a consortium meeting, how to do that. So good example. And we will have another one, if I can plug in for Susanna, the same. But yeah, okay. I'll say the same thing also later. But anyway, thank you. Over. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Benyam. And it's great to hear that you're already doing these things in the bank. It's great to hear, because a lot of our involvement in Some for All is in order to ensure that we're making a real influence on such major donors and loans that come from yourself and the MDBs. And of course, also that you make the point about transformational change. Transport is changing. And one of the great things about a moment of change is that you don't repeat the mistakes that are already embedded. So yes, great time to be taking all of this information on board. So thank you for your contribution. And then now I just want to turn to Magda from ITF. Obviously, and there never was any suggestion otherwise, this piece of work is a contribution to a field on which there are other players. TUMI, who had their conference here in Leipzig yesterday, a big players in the field. And I know ITF also have their own work that you've been doing. So you're going to talk a bit about that, Magda.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sheila. And good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be part of this discussion. And of course, my congratulations to the authors of this report, Isobel and Heather, to POLIS and FIA Foundation. It's incredibly insightful work on challenges and practical solutions. You give this sometimes this personal stories, how to break the glass ceiling and how to promote this women's participation in transport. And of course, ITF, as your stakeholders and also as a member of Some for All working group on gender, we have been supporting this work, and we see it complementary to the ITF Gender Analysis Toolkit for Transport Policy. This is the toolkit that we launched last year at the summit. So let me just highlight some work in this regard. This toolkit is aimed to help policymakers to integrate gender perspective into transport policy making. Just a few words why we think this toolkit is important for us, for our work. This is first because we consider gender analysis as the first step in towards achieving greater gender equality. So the gender analysis creates this better understanding of how to make public transport policies more effective, and how the impact can vary vary by gender. So this toolkit offers, just to say you a few words, I don't know, I think you see this a little bit better on the screen. So this toolkit offer a simple method for incorporating gender across transport policies projects, and it consists of 3 simple tools. So the first tool is a gender checklist. It's a list of 12 questions that can help with an initial assessment of how gender dimension is reflected in policy or given project. So when you go through this 12 general questions, how the gender is incorporated in your project work, you get a special benchmark, a score. So this score can vary, highlighting, for example, that unfortunately, there is no gender equality, or the project is not relevant to this, or there is a high equality for the given project or work. Then we have a set of the list of gender indicators, so policymakers can choose from this list of indicators that are most relevant to the project and to the work that they are developing. So we have 9 broad indicators, such as accessibility, safety, security, affordability, employment, education, just to name a few. And finally, the third tool is gender questionnaire. So it's a template to design surveys and data collection process. Again, it's an assessment tool on what are the data that exist and policies on gender in transport. So that's very briefly about the toolkit. It's an online tool, so you can interactive tool. So we very much invite you to try this toolkit and to see how it works, how it can be helpful for your work. And it is meant to be a dynamic tool, so we will be updating this as we are receiving feedback from policymakers and implementing this in the different projects. So we have started implementing this at the ITF projects. We started from ourselves, so to see how we can better advance this gender agenda. Just to finish, that in our views, ITF, we are here because we believe that all transport stakeholders have much to learn from each other in terms of scoring systems, in terms of checklist, case studies. So when we get together to share these different tools, it's incredibly enriching experience. And we, ITF, we aim to serve as this platform to share best practices on how to develop better policies, both for women workers working in the sector, but also for women transport users. We believe that these are two interconnected issues, as increase of gender inequality in the workforce is a way to improving the inclusiveness of transport services, not only for women, but also for all users. So thank you very much for inviting us here. Thank you.
Thank you, Magda, for that contribution. So any questions from the floor on any contribution we've heard so far? Online, I believe there is a capacity to ask questions also, but I'm not seeing them on this screen. So I think there may not be any, but anyone in the room have anything? Brilliant. Susanna.
Much work. How are you planning to mobilize resources within this room, outside this room, and ITF to promote this piece of work? And what can we do as experts?
Thank you. Thank you.
So I guess I can answer from POLIS's point of view here. So a lot of these case studies are taken from cities, regions, transport operators, people we've worked with. And a lot of this work goes back into the stuff that we do. So pulling together transport practitioners, policymakers, bringing them around the table to say, look, this is what you and your peers are doing. Why are you not doing it? You can do it. You know, the city right next to you is doing this. The operator in the neighboring country is implementing this measure. What can you learn from this to do this back at home? And what do you need to be able to do this? Because kind of, as I said earlier, it is about putting ourselves in the shoes of those employers, those making the change on the ground, to say, we understand where you're at, we understand the barriers that you're facing, and this is how you can start to work this up from the ground up. And it's about, I don't want to say shaming other people into taking these actions, but really saying that, yes, I mean, the imbalance is massive, and it is not to say that these actions that we present in these case studies are solely going to change this imbalance, but there are things that you can do. It's in some ways, it's a kind of sad piece of research to show the extent of the imbalance, but also it's encouraging to say, look, there are people doing things and you can do that too.
Heather, go ahead. Why don't you say something? Yes.
Thanks. So yes, just to build on what Isobel mentioned, I think we've got three pathways that we're going to actually use to help disseminate this work. And of course, the first one is with the people that you know supported it, with FEAR, with POLIS, with Some for All, with the ITF. There are many channels of communication that we can use. And just to wind back a little bit, one of the first reports that I wrote for FEAR, in fact, Safe and Sound, we've had just on ResearchGate. So this is outside of what FEAR Foundation have as downloads. I have 2,500 reads. Well, that's not bad on a gender-based report. You know, I have 3,500 reads on a CNG BRT report, which is always rather annoying. But there we are. That's that's reality. So we have our partners and their communication. We were also very encouraged with the outreach that we did for our interviews, that many of our interviewees said, listen, when this comes out, will you do a website or a webinar for us? Or can we do something? Can we disseminate it through our membership, through our people? This is really important because one of the things we tried to do was to try and make it very relevant to the needs of the sector at the moment and in its transformation. And the third thing is, obviously, we're going to, take it forward, take it out to other conferences, make sure that it is used. And we ask all of those out there in the audience and certainly the Some for All gender group working group to help us disseminate it. And, we've linked in with road safety. And so we're very keen that it gets out into the wider world.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah. So our time is almost at an end. We have space, maybe one more quick question over here.
Yeah, thank you. I know I've been involved with the gender working group. I had two points. One was, I think, I mean, last year we had the checklist, and this year there's this report. I think on its own, it does definitely provide a lot of case studies, and the data is still shocking, you know, when we read it. I think it would be useful to think of a kind of a wider campaign to make this visible with, I think, all the key players in this arena, because beyond a report, I mean, a report, I mean, 2000 is great, but we know people don't read reports. So webinars, but something a little sort of, even a social media campaign where you put everything out over a week or 10 days in bite-sized information, little interviews and stuff like that. That's the first thing. So congratulations. But the second thing is, I know this is excellent, but I think there is one part which is probably missing, which is the non-formal popular transport sector, which is what a lot of women from low-income neighborhoods across countries, across the world use. And I think to capture some of that, maybe volume 2 is needed to take some of this forward as well. So I would, thank you.
I agree with that completely. And I'm afraid our time is up, and the next event is actually a great and friendly colleague of ours from Some for All, who need to come up and present their report too. But I couldn't agree more, Kalpana, and nothing that we do at the foundation really is ever a full stop on anything. We're always trying to take it forward in a variety of different ways. And it's always great to have a moment when people feel that they want to band together or behind something. So let's take that as what we've got now. And we absolutely commit to supporting that as we go forward. So thank you to all of the people on the panel who I'm sure all wanted to say something more, but we're out of time. And I don't want to do the dirty on poor old Susanna. Please stay for Susanna's launch of her report for Some for All. Take a copy of the gender report or download it from the QR code on this leaflet. And yes, you will hear more on this topic. Thank you.